What's going on, everybody? Welcome to this week's Lumix Live. We have a lot of really kind of fun stuff, at least what I consider to be fun stuff to talk about today. And primarily, as you've seen on the title of the particular stream that we're on today, we're going to be going through the menus and kind of making sense of some of the different options that are available on particularly the GH6, given that there's been a lot of questions that I've been fielding through the Reddit forums, Facebook, Instagram, and even in the emails. So I felt now was probably a good time to actually go over a lot of this stuff and, show you guys how to understand some of the menus. Particularly, one of the things that we're going to talk about is actually the waveform and how you can actually read the waveform and what the different numbers mean. But yeah, with these particular streams, if this is the first time you are joining us, these are weekly broadcasts that we do every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and really just for the purpose of allowing all of you an opportunity to ask us questions. Get answers directly from the manufacturer, so it's not through some third party that is making a guess on an answer. If it's something that I can't answer, I'll typically let you know that I can't answer it. So anyone that's been joining us for a while, you know that like future products I can't talk about, future firmware update stuff, anything outside of what we've already publicly announced, you kind of understand that I can't talk about some of those things. But we use a lot of this content and a lot of the feedback that all of you provide to help us develop the next iterations of cameras, the next iteration of firmware. So even if there's something that I can't really address here, know that we see these comments, we see the feedback that all of you provide, and it just helps us make better products as we move forward. So before we go too far into it, I want to remind everybody about Lumix Pro Services. We talk about this every single week. We have here in the United States, we have the Red and the Platinum tier. Red is free. If you own a Lumix camera, you should get yourself registered over on Lumix Pro Services Red. That gets you basically into the platform should you have any issues about, the kind of camera. If you need to get it sent into service, this is the portal that you're going to use instead of going through the general Panasonic service and support. And then if you're someone who really wants that extra level of kind of comfort with your equipment, take a look at the Platinum series or the Platinum membership. This is a paid tier for our service program. It gets you a little bit, kind of bumped up capabilities with the program, so you get faster turnaround time on warranted and out of warranty repairs. You get discounts on out of warranty repair in case you happen to maybe drop a lens or a camera and you want to get it serviced. You also get a lot of cool things like sensor cleanings and EVF cleanings throughout the year. So if you're someone who uses your equipment pretty heavily, the Platinum tier may be something you want to take a look at. We have links in the description below for to get over to that page to go check it out. We also have links in the description for you to go check out our Instagram page. If you have any continuing conversations that you want to have with us, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram. If you want to get your photos or your videos featured on our channel, we've got ways to do that over there. What else am I missing? Yeah, I think that's primarily it. So want to look through some of the questions that we've got already here in the chat and address some of those. And I've got a whole bunch in a document here that we've gotten through the emails, and some are going to be a little more in depth that we're going to go through. So let's see here. One of the first things that we had come in was from Great Things Studios. Would be great on the BS1H and BGH1 to choose the size of the audio meters, off, on, and set. Normal and small, sometimes you want it, but not that big, especially on a 5-inch monitor. It's definitely something that we can pass on to the engineers. I don't know if getting the resizing the UI out over HDMI is something that's easily done. I know that we have asked that before, and we've had some other questions about it as well, depending on the monitor size you use, because it's a static UI that goes over, and then if it's a high-res monitor, there's no scaling. So yeah, that's something that we can pass over to the team and see if it's something that's feasible. It might not be feasible. It kind of just depends. But yeah, we'll ask. Let's see here. Strons is here early. Nice to see you here again, Strons. Chris, Lumix S1 can manually set the dual native ISO, but the S5 can't. Is there any benefit to manually setting it versus just leaving it on auto? There can be, in certain cases. It really comes down into the two different styles that some people will film in, right? In cameras like our Vericam that has two base ISOs or two native ISOs that you work at, a lot of times you would treat the way you shoot with a camera like this as if they were film stock, right? So that means that you're going to set it at 800 or you're going to set it at 5000 on a Vericam, and then you're going to light your scene accordingly. If you need to lower or pull your exposure down, then you would pull down from one of those different areas. It basically allows you to kind of just reduce a little bit of dynamic range to get a cleaner image, but also in some cases, if you're okay with a little bit noisier of an image, that's where you can go off those base points. In cameras like the S1 and the S1H, where you can manually select these, they're added in with those cameras because in our research, in our conversations with filmmakers that are using those particular cameras, it's one of the ways that people typically tend to work. In the S5, this is set up as automatic because there are vastly more people using the S5 that typically don't shoot that way and typically would never shoot that way. So in that particular camera, the way that you basically just do it is you just roll the ISO up to 4000, that changes the circuitry over, and you start using the high gain circuit. If you were to just leave your ISO in auto, it's going to ramp through that entire range. So it's just a matter of their different cameras and the different levels of the market, I guess would be a good way to put it. That's what can kind of help dictate what features can or should be in a certain camera when you're looking at a really large group of users that are just getting into this and the added complexity may be way over top. So yeah, with the S5, leaving it in auto is fine. With the S1 and the S1H, it just means that you have that option to shoot with in that particular style, if that's how you normally shoot. So hopefully that answered your question, Chris. Yeah, and I think I addressed the second part of that, is with the S5, putting your ISO at 4000 sets it on that higher gain scale, so you're pretty much set there. Nicholas asks, looking forward to the 18mm f1.8 Lumix lens. Yep, that we did announce is in development for the S series. Any upcoming camera Panasonic events we should be on the lookout for in order to get more details? So not particularly towards camera announcements or firmware or anything like that, but Matt Frazier, myself, Neil Matsumoto, and our ambassador Todd White will all be at NAB this year. And for those that are going to be in Vegas and want to go to NAB, you can definitely stop by, talk to us in person. That show is the 24th, 25th, 26th, and 27th of April. So end of this month, we'll be out in Las Vegas. And yeah, swing by the booth, come chat with us, check out the equipment. We're going to have all the stuff there set up, ready to go. So you'll be able to actually come in and play around with cameras and ask us questions in person, which is always kind of nice. Let's hear. Dennis says, Lumix Pro Service lost my login information. Who do I connect? I believe there should be an email address right on the bottom of the LPS site, or if you've received an email from them, you can reply into that. Yeah, otherwise I'll let the team know that some people are looking to reach out because of login info, and I'll try to get a little bit better information on how to actually reach out to those guys. Let's hear. Nick says, just want to confirm that I got a notification from LBS that your CF Express card is shipped. That's awesome. Yep, I know that a lot of people, I think, are now going to starting to receive them. Obviously, anytime you have a promotion like that, the lead up to confirming that you've actually bought the camera and you qualify for it, sometimes that takes just a little bit longer. Especially still in these days. But yeah, as you guys get them, definitely let us know. One thing that I do want to mention actually about the CF Express cards, because I have seen a couple people running into, not issues, but questions about it. So on the GH6, and I will actually jump into this real quick to show you. In the GH6, one of the things that you're going to notice when you're using a CF Express card is under the card format option now, you have the ability to do a low-level format, which is a much more intense way to format media. And I highly advise, with anyone that's getting the CF Express cards and you're going to work with them, no matter what the card is, whether it's on our list or not, make sure that when you first start using that card, do a low-level format of the card, because this sets the card up to know how to write from the camera or how to receive information from the camera. If you skip this step, this is where you can run into issues where the camera tells you, like, hey, the card's too slow, or hey, you're having this, this kind of problem. This motion is overloading a certain speed rating because that base file structure wasn't set. It's a similar situation that you run into if you're jumping cards back and forth between cameras. For the most part, you typically are going to be okay, but it does increase the chance of running into some problems. So with those cards, make sure you do that low-level format. You'll see it as an option in the menu when you're doing the CF Express card format in camera. And 100%, do not format cards outside of the camera and then just throw them in the camera and expect them to work perfectly fine. SD cards, there is a particular tool that you use for this, but it still is always good practice to make sure you format in camera, just to cut that point of possible failure out of the image storage line. Let's see, Sky, welcome Sky. I'm actually going to be addressing your question on the stream here. I can never pronounce your name, but hi, right under Sky. Hi, Jason from Houston. Nice, another Texan here. Pete says, let's talk about the update 1.2 for the GH6. Yes, so for those that may not know, there was an update for the GH6 that has just come out. There were two things that were updated, particularly with that update. The first one being a red or magenta cast that can show up on the screen when you're using different combinations of recording. That was corrected with this firmware, so thank you everybody who brought that up to us. It allowed our engineers to be able to be like, oh, hey, let's fix this quick. So they did that. The other one was a fix for a kind of vertical line issue that would happen when you use a very specific combination of ultra-wide lens and electronic stabilizer. And I'm happy to report, at least with a number of people that have reached out to me, this firmware corrected those issues for them. So minor little update for the camera. You can get it at the link. I believe we have the link down in the description. If not, I'll find it and drop it in the chat to get the update for the camera. For those that want to update through the mobile device, I have actually put a question into my team as to when that's going to be pushed through the app. So right now, it may not pop up on your app that you have a firmware update available for the GH6. In case like that, just do it through the normal method of download, put it on an SD card, put it in the camera. But it is something that I've asked our team about since it's not showing up yet. So yeah, let's see here. Great things. Where can we send detailed feature requests and firmware updates on the box cameras? You can either drop them right in the chat here, or you can always feel free to send us an email over at lumixlive@us.panasonic.com. The address is in the video description below. And we check those, and we can pass those on to our team through that path. Yeah. Let's see here. G Creations recently upgraded to an S1H from the GH5. Is there any newer update for the S1H VFR firmware update? So nope, there hasn't been anything updated on the S1H for a little bit of time right now. Primarily focusing on GH6 updates and stuff like that currently. Brett says, just snagged the GH6 after working with the GH4 and was going to get a GH5S, but nah, GH6 is a serious piece of gear. Yes, it is. It's a really fun camera to shoot with. ProPixel, will the S5 get 4K 120? No. You would need a hardware change for things like that. Brett, got your complimentary card. Awesome to see that. Tara, looking forward to hearing how to set Q menus so that it works across all photo modes and how to get FN buttons settings to work across all photo modes. That's actually one that I've been digging further into, so I don't have a ton of information, particularly today, about this one, Tara. But it is something I'm looking into. I did get your message, and will put something together specifically for that. I just haven't had time to really be able to dig deep into that and come up with like a good explanation of how everything works for everybody. But we can go through and show some of the basics of how it should work. Let's see here. Nice. Low-level format plus NAND flash into erase state rather than just initializing FAT tables if CF Express uses exFAT. Yeah. Yeah, it's a much better platform if you're on CF Express for things like that. Let's hear. Chris, recommendations on AF settings for running on wedding filmmakers. I use one area and -1, -3, but I would like to catch focus faster and stay locked on the subject. So one of the things that I highly advise everybody, as the focusing system has evolved with our systems from previous GH series cameras and other G series cameras, the original settings that a lot of people came up with for the GH5 or, the S series aren't really a good way to start when you go onto a new system. One of the biggest things is to basically just say, look, start everything at 0 and then retune yourself based on your particular shooting style. By just starting at -3, -1, or -1, -3, I've written it, I have no way to really give you anything that's going to be better in the particular setup. So what I typically suggest is, like any camera, set everything back to 0 or to the normal state. Do a couple of tests, obviously not in a wedding. Do a couple of tests and play with the different settings to see what works best for you. We do have the AF Guidebook online, which is primarily for the video side of shooting. It explains what each of these options do for you. So yeah, I really don't have a perfect recommendation for the way you set it up. For instance, these streams, because I'm not moving a lot, I don't really, kind of bounce around all that much. I'm not having to track focus. The only thing I change on mine is I change I think it's the speed to -2 on my BS1H. Because I don't want it moving a whole lot while I move. I want to be able to do something like this and not have it jump one side or another. It's kind of it's the right balance I've found for this kind of shooting. Yeah. Let's hear. JC, the GH5 allowed you to save camera settings on an SD card. Will this be added to the GH6? I believe it was. If it's not, shows you how much I use it. Yeah, it's in the menu. So if I go here, so the GH6, when you go into the camera menu, you go to the wrench. So you go to the wrench setting, you go to the cog within the wrench, you go to save, restore camera settings, you can save it. I only have a CF Express card in here right now, so that's why it's there. But yeah, you do that. The other nice thing that was added with the GH6 is that you have the keep settings when you format. The older way that these cameras were set up was that if you formatted the cards, you lost your save file. So now there's an option. Make sure that's turned on. Then you can format it and you're all good to go. So, let's see here. When streaming with the GH6 via USB, there's no sound. What's preventing this feature in the GH6 and BGH1 when using USB? That's a good question. With USB not streaming, using it as a webcam, audio is not part of the interface, part of what data is sent over. And this is, from my understanding, this is the same across all interchangeable lens cameras that support a USB type way of acting as a webcam. I don't think it has anything to do with not wanting to do it. Or being able to do it. It's just that connection doesn't support it. So for USB webcam, at least from cameras like this, that's why the audio is not connecting or not coming across in that way. So, yeah. Let's see here. Andy says, is there a firmware coming about recording just 2 tracks for audio? Because right now it's 4 channels by default when recording an MOV. I don't think there is. You have four channels are what come through, like a lot of other higher end cameras that record 4-channel audio. But I can bring it up to the team to see if that's something that they've considered, or if there's a reason why it doesn't do it. But yeah, I can bring it up. So the reason about a GH6 is because we have this dialogue with you, Panasonic, and they actually listen to us. Well, thank you so much. That's such a great thing to say. I really appreciate that feedback. Thank you. Is an S1 or an S5 Mark II on the horizon? Pro Pixel, I have no comment on future product development or anything like that. So, all right. Now let's get into the actual questions that we had coming up before. So one of the questions we got at the beginning here was from Sky, asking about the different clipping points and the way the GH6 works compared to like the GH5 in the previous lineups. And it has to do with the differences between 100 IRE, 109 IRE or percent compared to the different cameras. And basically, there are differences between how the GH6 works and how it's capturing the imagery versus how the GH5 did. And you're pretty much seeing that, right? So to start with, let me do this one. So I've got, since I can't output a waveform over HDMI, I've got another camera hooked up here looking at the back of my GH6, and I have the waveform here. So a couple things that I wanted to point out for everybody, just so you understand how the waveform is to be interpreted. So you have the main box on with waveform. You have a dotted line on the bottom, then you have a solid line, and then you have more dotted lines, and then a solid line, dotted line, solid line, dotted line. What these are indicating is that the top solid line is 100 IRE. So that's 100%, it's IRE, that's clipping in the broadcast sense. The middle solid line is 50%, the bottom solid line is 0. The line below, all the way at the bottom, the dotted line is -4 IRE, and then on the GH6, the top dotted line is 105 percent IRE, or 105%. So what does that mean for how you actually expose? Well, what you'll see in the camera as you move through is I can sit here, and we know that right now I've got the camera set in V-Log. Well, V-Log is its highest point is going to be at 90%, so 90 IRE. And you see that when I overexpose this, it hits that 90 line, and then it plateaus out. So what that means is that I can expose with my waveform all the way up to 90% and know that that is going to be within, you're not going to be clipping any of your highlights. So I can then bring it into post, bring it back into a range that makes sense for my output, whether I'm doing something like HDR editing or if I'm doing a standard Rec 709. It means that my base canvas now has the maximum recorded dynamic range that I then compress down into my final output. The bottom lines, you'll see that right now it's that my bottom line is at about 10% or 10 IRE, roughly, if you go by each of those lines. So right now, I'm not dropping anything below 10 IRE. Now, on the GH6, there's a really cool tool, and actually, I think I have to move my... yeah, I'll move this. Make it a little bit easier to see. So, right here, what you can see with this is that... So, I have my Luminance spot meter being used for this particular demo. So, if I go to this light here, you'll see that that light is in V-Log showing me that it's 5.2 stops over middle gray, so over 18% gray. The camera can take up to 5.5 stops overexposed and still have detail before it clips. So if I go through here and I click a little bit more wide open, you'll see that it stops at 5.5, but I can tone this back down here and know, all right, now I'm at 5.4. That means that, one, my shadows are going to be up much higher, as you can see, and by that it means that my 18% gray is actually floating at about 4 stops overexposed. So I now have this basic setup that I can work with. I have the maximum amount of highlight information that I'm going to capture, and I'm keeping my shadows from going way too deep into the shadow region to pull up in log. This is one way to capture. A lot of people, this is ETTR, exposed to the right. And this can be a good way to work. There are some downsides to doing it when it comes to things like the way skin tones can be remapped back down. You do want to be a little careful with shooting this way. But if your goal is to get the maximum amount of dynamic range, you can do it this way. This will help you keep your shadows cleaner when you're doing a conversion over. It's one way to work. Now, the other way to work with this is to basically take this gray card, and I'm going to stop this down to now where my gray card shows me pretty much 0 stops. So right now, this tells me that my exposure, my midtones, are in the right spot. My 18% gray is set up at 18% gray. It's the proper midtone, and I have enough flexibility to add more shadow or lift the shadows or pull the highlights or light for the highlights. Now, what this looks like on the waveform is you'll see this. So that gray card is floating just above the 40, but just below the 50 line. So that means that my midtones are properly exposed. Now, shooting this way and using the scales this way means that you're going to have to light your image to give it the contrast you want. If I want more detail in the shadows, I would take this little light that I've got here, and let me brighten this up. I would add this, and then you can see now that that's going to start lifting the overall image. I want to try to bring this stuff out of the basement in the dynamic range, and I can kind of do that. It's a little difficult to show in this demo, and those that are actual lighting professionals, you know infinitely better than I do how to do this properly. But ultimately what you're seeing there is that you have that information. Now this is all in log. So we know that you don't clip at 100% in log, you clip at 90 for your highlights. Well, if I change the camera back to, and let me do this, if I change the camera to 709, right now you'll see that my midtones are at 32%, which still isn't kind of correct. I actually want those to go up to 42. Close. 44. Close enough. So what it's telling me here in this particular shot now is that my midtones are at 44. My highlight-ish area in this shot is only 73%, so it's not going to be clipping into the highlights. But I can easily do the same thing. I can brighten this image up and start to get it to where, say, 100%. That means now that in Rec 709, that highlight is at the clipping point. It is, you're not going to, there's no information above it if you're outputting in a 709 end file. The reason that these go above, up to 109, is that these are super white. So that means that this is above what the broadcast or 709's white point is. The reason why this, at least in this scale, shows you 108, 109%, in the zebras it's 105%. The reason why those are different compared to like your GH5 is just that the GH5 had a different, that's Vlog L, this is Vlog and V-Gamut, the different sensor technologies, so there's going to be a little bit of a difference there. But now, if I go back and we look at the waveform, you see on the waveform it's representing that I'm going above that 100% line, that top solid line. Where if I bring my exposure back down here, you'll see that now when I get to about here, I'm back to where I'm not clipping my brightest highlight. And Luminance Spot Meter is going to show you that. I'm at 93% instead of all the way up to the 109%. My midtones are way higher than they should be, but then my shadow regions are going to be a little more protected. So this is one way to use the different tools that you have in the GH6 to kind of get your exposure to, or to maximize the amount of dynamic range you have. Just because the numbers are different between the GH5 and a GH6 doesn't mean that you leave anything on the table if you're comparing side by side with these two cameras. And the reason for that is that, like I said, they're different technologies. It's different hardware. The GH6, with the DR boost mode on, is actually getting an additional stop of highlight retention with a little bit cleaner shadow noise when you're using these modes. And it changes depending on the color profile you're in. So if I'm looking at, in our menu here, if I go up to my recording options here, you'll see that with ISO sensitivity, I have 800 as my base right now, or my lowest ISO in Rec 709 because I'm using DR boost. If I turn dynamic range boost off, what you'll see now is that I can keep going. I can do the exact same thing, but this particular scene doesn't need that extra dynamic range for this particular setup. I can come in here, I can move my luminance spot meter to somewhere like deeper in the shadow-ish region. We'll go about here. It's probably about as dark as I'm going to be able to get it. You see that that's showing me that it's at 4. So you have a couple of these different tools. You can see how they work different for the setup. Let's see here. Question is, I can see on the GH6 waveform clipping at 105, but when I see that in Final Cut, clipping's at 100, but that doesn't happen with the GH5. So Final Cut, I think that's probably more just, wait. So the GH6 shows clipping at 105, but when you put it in Final Cut, clipping is at 100. That kind of sounds like an issue with Final Cut, honestly. Because depending on what your project set up, 100% is going to be 100% for that. The GH5 being able to go to 109 isn't really going to make that big of a... Well, I'm a little perplexed on that one. Because I guess I partially just misunderstood your question, so... I will have to do a little bit more research on that one then, Sky. But as far as I know, if you're using the camera and you use the camera's tools for this, yeah, the natural profile and like 709 are going to be the same exposure tools there. Probably the biggest difference, honestly, is just that natural's going to be a little more crushed than most of the other profiles. So you want to be a little careful with that, depending on how much you want to really push there. But if you do want to send me a little more information about this, I can dig further into it and try to get you more info. But for everybody else that's, looking at how to actually use the waveform and stuff like that, like you basically just go off what the waveform is telling you in camera. The software... If you're using the waveform and you're shooting properly to make sure that you're at that 100% IRE or the 105% if you're shooting for super whites, then there's going to be a little bit of a difference there. Typically, now that we have luminance spot meter in a number of the cameras, I rarely use the waveform, honestly. Because I can just come in here and literally just go right to the point that I want, and I know exactly where it's sitting within the dynamic range of the camera. So I know that I can go over right to my highlight, and I know that this is only 84%. I can dial it up if I'm exposing to the right, make sure that I stay under 100%, and then you should be good. If you're shooting for HDR, I wouldn't be using these profiles anyway. I'd shoot in log and just do it by stops. Or in HLG, and know that the scale changes for HLG also. So, yeah. Okay. So, where was the next question that came in here? So that's probably about as much as I'll bang on about that particular setup. Tara says, if I turn off sound rec level display and save C1 photos and then go to any of my custom modes, it's turned off, even if I had turned it on and saved my settings for that custom mode. So that cross compatibility, or the cross like kind of universal change on, that is stuff that I do have to reach the engineers to see if that's something that can be done as a global change, or if they stick to those particular options because of the way the custom modes work, Tara. But it is something that I have already reached out about, but I do have to dig a little bit deeper into. Let's see here. JC, per my earlier question about sound and USB streaming on the GH6, why not add a USB to Ethernet adapter like your Panasonic CX10 4K camcorder? Well, at that point, you're not sending it over USB. You're sending it as RTSP or RTMP if you're going to go out to an end server. The GH5 Mark II does have USB-C to Ethernet capabilities. And we don't actually make the adapter, but we support use of that for one of these on a GH5 Mark II. So that functionality does exist. But when you're using it like that, as a webcam, it's not going to... Most webcam utilities don't pick up an RTSP video feed as that. Plus, you have the added latency that you don't have with USB or even HDMI. Typically, RTSP has higher latency. So we can ask if the GH6 is going to be able to get that kind of support. I don't know if it's going to get that support, but I do know that the GH5 Mark II does have USB-C to gigabit Ethernet for RTSP, RTMP. You can basically control it like a box camera with the Lumix Tether software if you needed. So, let's see here. All right, so let me do this. We'll go to this main camera, and then I can move this camera out of the way now. Cool. Makes it a little bit easier. So, continuing in like with some of these different menu options, we get a lot of the questions about, you know, how do you actually use some of these different options? And I want to start with the timecode. Way that we work with timecode in the GH6 and the different cameras. So the vast majority of people that reach out to us are using timecode for triggering on an external monitor. Maybe not as required anymore now that we can do ProRes internally, but for those that are going to be doing external ProRes options, being able to just click one button to trigger external recording is an important part. And with our system, it's a couple-step process. So the first thing that you have to do is go into timecode. You want to turn timecode display on. So what this means is that you're then going to have timecode running on the display in the camera. But importantly, you want to make sure you go to HDMI timecode output and turn this on as well. This means that it's going to be sending timecode out over HDMI to the receiving device so that it knows, okay, here's the timecode, this is the information I need. Because a lot of the external recorders basically activate the triggering off timecode, not off any other kind of signal. So you want to make sure HDMI timecode output is turned on. And then from here, you want to make sure that you go to your HDMI output settings. So you go HDMI rec output. And then you want to turn HDMI recording control. You want to make sure you turn that on as well. When both of those options are on, you'll see in the top left corner of the camera, you have an HDMI, the word HDMI, and then the pause icon next to it. This is telling you that the camera is now set up, and it's sending out the timecode information out there. So you've got everything set up. Your external recorder at that point, all you have to do is tell it that you want to take the triggering information over HDMI, and then it's looking for timecode, and then you're set. When you click the record button on the camera, it will start and trigger the record out for your external options there. So there's that. Let's see here. Before I go to the next part, Redbit's question. 2 requests for the S1. 1, option to disable HDMI sound out recording, reduce lag on the, okay, yeah, because it reduces lag on the S1H. And 2, all-eye recording, So the S1's not going to get all-eye recording. If you need all-intro recording, that's what a GH6 or an S1H is. I can pretty much guarantee that the S1 and S5 aren't going to get all-intro recording. I don't know if it's a thermal thing. I don't know if the time limits are so short. I just know that I've asked, and we've basically been like, no, it's pretty much an S1H. Let's see here. The other question. Any news on 4.4K 4.3? Was said that it's supposed to be full sensor, but it isn't. So 4.4K is a crop in on the sensor for 48 and 60 frames per second. I can look into what your question is. But yeah, it is cropped into the sensor. It always has been, and I believe it always will be, so that it can get the faster readout with lower rolling shutter. But yeah, we can continue to keep checking on stuff like that. So one of the other things that we've had here, and we've gotten a decent number of questions about this, is actually in with the fan control on the GH6. So a couple of things that you'll notice here is that in a number of the video modes, one, you don't have an off option. So the fan is either always going to be in an auto function, or it's going to be on in a different state. In the higher bitrate options and higher recording modes, it does limit what options you have for the fan if you're looking at having it as kind of a fixed speed. But where we get a lot of the kind of confusion, and hopefully this can help, is when really you would want to use the difference between Auto 1 and Auto 2. So the camera will only ever turn the fan on if it actually needs it to mitigate and manage the thermal load that comes from things like the CF Express cards and residual heat that the body can't dissipate. So that's why out of the box, typically it's going to be an Auto 2. And for the vast majority of shooting, Auto 2's probably going to be perfectly fine for, most shooting environments. The only other time that I'd ever actually say go to like the fast or the highest speed mode is if you know that you're in an environment that's going to be incredibly hot and you just want to make sure that you're keeping it as cool as possible and you don't want to let any thermal buildup happen. You just put it on there. It does give you the notification that if you have an on-camera mic, you may start to hear it, because it's going to act much closer like an actual cinema, like higher-end cinema camera. Higher-end cinema cameras typically do have really loud fans, but with our camera, you have that option to change it to whatever works for you. So normally, I have mine set up in Auto 2, and I could be running for 2 to 3 hours worth of recording, and maybe the fan gets to standard as far as the speed goes. It's never really audible. I've never heard it before. And it still just gives you that solid option to work with. Auto 1 is just a more aggressive fan curve. This means that you're rarely probably going to run into a situation where the fan is off. You're going to have it set for Auto 1 in this case, which would mean that at the lowest, it's just going to be running slow to just keep air moving through the system. So depending on the scenario, if you're not worried about any kind of sound at all, you're in like anechoic chamber and it's okay to have a little bit of sound, then, leave it in Auto 2, because then it's just going to let you, kind of go through the different range. It's going to handle it on its own. Auto 1, it's always going to basically have the fan running at some level. It just ramps up a little bit sooner because it's going to prioritize keeping a cooler load. And then, you just have those different options there. If you notice, like I said, in ProRes, you're going to run into most cases where you can't lower this below standard, I believe. It's standard and high, and those are the two options that you basically have. And when you're in auto, it will keep it off until it needs to, and then it turns on and it goes right up to standard. It doesn't ramp up through those lower ones. The only time that you can turn the fan off completely is when you're in the photography options where it's not really as necessary. But even in cases like that, I typically will always leave it as Auto 2, or I will actually go into the fast or the highest speed mode if I'm doing any kind of longer exposure, just to do the added benefit of keeping the internals cooler on the camera. Cooler cameras run with lower noise and just produce a cleaner looking image. So let's see here. Nick says, is it safe to charge G9 batteries in the GH6 charger and vice versa? Is it safe to use G9 formatted SD cards in the GH6 vice versa? Both seem to work okay. Just wondering if it's safe. So batteries, yeah, it's perfectly fine to charge G9 batteries in the charger that comes with the GH6. In fact, we've actually pretty much gotten rid of the older kind of sled style charger for the drop-in style. That's what it was originally designed for. It's why the GH6 batteries have the two different connectors on it. Some of the cameras use the top, some use the side. And yeah, it kind of just lets you do those different options there. As far as the SD cards, even within a brand, I do not recommend changing cards between cameras and not formatting them in the camera that you're using. Anytime you make a change like that, you open up the possibility of causing some issues. More down to the line of the card is already being written to by one camera, so it's already got folders set up and it's already got file numbers set up on it. When you put it in another camera, you could end up with duplicate file numbers and duplicate folders, or issues involving that. So you want to be careful when you're changing cards out, because you don't know where your last file number stopped, and then when you put it in the new camera, you'll end up having photos from different times in folders, because it doesn't know that it's writing to a new folder. So, big recommendation, always make sure that you're formatting in the camera that you're going to use. Let's see here. FC, are there any disadvantages to using lower ISO than native? Otherwise, use ND close down aperture to shoot at a native ISO. Yes, there can be negatives to shooting below a native ISO. Primarily, it's in your dynamic range. You're going to clip your highlights sooner as you start to pull your exposure down, but you get a cleaner looking image. So, for the most part, you want to look at your particular scenario. If you're looking at a scene where you know you've got more than enough highlight dynamic range across the board, then yeah, you can start shooting at lower ISOs and pull those numbers down, go into extended, and you should be okay. But just know that your highlights are going to clip sooner. Probably the best way to do it, at least the way I recommend doing it, is get a good set of ND filters and shoot at a base ISO with the NDs. While your image may be a little bit noisier than not, if you're pulling your ISO down, you're still going to get the best dynamic range out of it, which is going to give you more flexibility in post for the way you want to edit and kind of shift things around. So it just gives you a couple of different options there. But yes, there are some negatives to shooting below native ISOs. Let's see here. JR says, is there any hope for raw open gate output over HDMI for the S1H? I honestly don't know. 3:2 aspect ratio video is not video. 3:2 aspect ratio would be something that an external recorder would have to be able to understand and write to. And then it's up to whether or not the camera has enough horsepower to encode and send that information over HDMI, or over the data side of HDMI. So I don't know. I like to think there's always hope, but there's no guarantee. So, yeah. I think you said it last week. In the press release, it says 420 10-bit, 5.8K 30p, and then 4.4K 60p. Anamorphic 4.3 can be recorded utilizing full area of the sensor. That's a good point. I will have to bring that up and check through all those things. But 4.4K is definitely in a crop on the sensor. I can guarantee that. Let's see here. It's okay and understandable that all-eye, not an option for the S1 and S5. It's great. Couple of cameras, the S1H anyway, yeah. Let's see here. I have to buy a couple of CF Express cards. Is there a compatible list for the S1 and S1R somewhere? Well, yes, there is actually. So we have a couple of lists online. Let me see if I can pull it up quick here for everybody. And while I'm waiting for that to load up, let's go to one of the other parts here that we had questions about. This other one is actually going to be in the photo modes for this camera. And it's actually the new setup that we've added for time-lapse functionality. So on the GH6, we've updated the time-lapse options in this camera and how you actually work with them. So if we're looking here, I just moved my top dial here to go to the time-lapse option. So that's going to be the second one from the top. And you'll notice on the bottom right of the screen there, you get a little icon that's got 1,440 photos next to it, and then you've got that icon. So when you press menu, with the vast majority of these kind of special settings that you have in a camera, it's going to bring you right to that menu option. So in this case, time-lapse and animation. Now, a little known thing that I'm willing to bet maybe 2 people on this stream may have known about is that now when you go to image count and shooting interval on the GH6, you have the ability to click menu and then now click display. What this now added in the GH6 is an actual calculator internally for figuring out what frame rate you want to output your project in, what video length you want it to be, and then how long your duration is going to be. So I can come in, as of course I click out of it. So I can come in here, click the display button. I can change my project to 24 frame. So say I'm outputting just typical 24 frames per second. Then I can come in, pick the length of my shot, pick the duration. Let's say that I'm going to be doing this for 5 hours. And right there, it's telling me that the image count is going to be 1,440 images at a 12.5 second shooting interval. So I can click display, and then I want my shooting setup to reflect that info above. So click yes, and it auto-populates all this stuff in here. This makes it possibly one of the easiest ways to actually, kind of get yourself set up with time-lapse without having to use necessarily an external calculator or device to get you that information. So let's see here. Let me go to that support site. Let me get you the information. Let's go to Lumix cameras. Forgot that our site changed. And then we'll get you that list, red bit. Where is it? Here we go, compatibility. So you're asking about the S1 and S1R. S1, S1R, CF Express. Let's do at red bit. There you go. So Redbit, that's the link that'll have what's been tested for us for CF Express cards on the S1 and S1R. Let's see here. Nick says, should you make sure to not have mechanical shutter on for long, big time lapses to avoid hundreds of thousands of extra shutter count? Yeah, but I'm going to put a caveat on that because it's going to depend on the camera that you have. With the GH6, one of the things you'll notice when you go into the shutter type is you have an additional option that some of the other cameras don't have, and that's electronic plus noise reduction. So if you're doing a time-lapse and you're going to be doing longer exposure work, typically for something like that, you're going to have to be in mechanical shutter. But if you're going to be doing long time-lapse with, say, like the GH6, I typically put it in electronic plus noise reduction. This way I can do longer than 1 second. And then, yeah, it's perfectly fine. It saves actuations on the actual shutter mechanism, so that's always a good thing. You have no penalty by using an electronic shutter for stills in the GH6. Decades ago, cameras had penalties for going into electronic shutter where you would drop bit depth, but the GH6 doesn't have that issue. So you're still going to be, if you're shooting RAW, you're still going to get that 16-bit container RAW file that you're able to work with. And yeah, it's probably one of the better ways to set it up. So that's a good thing to bring up, Nick. Let's hear FC. If image count is set to 0 when shooting intervals at 12 seconds, will it shoot time-lapse forever until shutter is pressed again? That's a good question. I've never actually tested that. So if we do image count to 0, we can test this right now, live on camera. Nope. So you have to set something in here. You have to set some sort of number for it to be able to actually get that info in there. Michael Turner, let me see. Where was your question? Did I see a question? If I missed your question, Michael Turner, if you can just type the question back in, I can look to see if I can get to it, because I don't see it on my side. At least not tagged as Lumix cameras for my side. So, yeah, I'm not seeing your question here. So if you drop your question back or comment back into the chat, I'll happily address it. So a couple of the other things here in the menus that have changed and updated for the GH6 is that you now also have the option, if I put this camera into Aperture Priority, you have a couple of newer things on here. So I set the camera into Aperture Priority, and I have the ability to turn on exposure leveling. Exposure leveling is something that the camera will do when you have the camera set up in Aperture Priority, and it's going to let the camera shift the aperture if it needs. What this will do is this will vary the aperture ever so slightly if you're doing a time lapse that's going to have a big shift in lighting, so that you get more of a smooth gradation through the entire time and not big heavy skips. Certain lenses, because aperture blades never close down to the exact same position every single time, I mean, we're talking to ultra precise level, exposure leveling helps offset this and blends those images through to kind of actually help smooth out the longer term time-lapse shooting. And then for probably the biggest addition here is that you now have to create new folders at recording. So previously, if you did time-lapse in the Lumix cameras, you would start a time-lapse, it just picks up at the next number and the next file that would be in the folder that you're already shooting in. But now you have the option that when you go to shoot a time-lapse, it's going to start a new folder, and then it's going to start a new number when you actually click record. This is really just more of what I'd call like a quality of life update. This just makes it easier for organization later in post when you're actually going to take these files off and actually start working with them, so that you can then know, okay, these are the time-lapse folders, and then we're all good to go for that part of it. So let's see here. Did that other question come in here yet? Okay, Michael, when filming weddings, I have problems with lights flickering even when shooting at 180 degrees shutter, even on your A66. I just bought a GH5 Mark II, but flicker decrease is grayed out. So, on the GH5s, GH5 Mark II, what you're actually going to look for is called Synchro Scan on these cameras. Let me put my camera back into video, and I will show you what you want to look for. So in our cameras, we have, and I'm going to fumble until I find it here, we have an option here called Synchro Scan. You'll notice that flicker decrease in video is also disabled on this particular camera. Flicker decrease is designed for the photo way into video. So if you're in a photo mode and you click the red button, it's kind of an auto mode for this. But in a more professional sense, you want to go to Synchro Scan. When you turn Synchro Scan on, what it allows you to do is, one, you can be working in shutter angle. So you're doing actual degrees instead of saying 1/125th or 1/50th for your shutter speed. You're actually setting this up into degrees. 180 degree would mean that you're perfectly double the frame rate that you're set up. So you've got basically the setup there with it. But for particularly when you're shooting in scenarios where you're going to be having some light flickering, like I can get light flickering in here if I set my shutter speed wrong on my BS1H here. So I'm going to change this. So I'm at 216 degrees right now. If I change this to, I think I can get it to do it at 60? No. 90? No. 120? No. Alright, well, my lights aren't really wanting to do it. 120 is kind, or 180 degrees kind of doing it a little bit, I can see. But basically, you have a couple of options. When you're in shutter angle, you can just click in here, click on 180 degree, and you should be okay. But I typically go up one, so I typically shoot at 216 degrees for my shutter angle here. And that makes it basically where I have no issues with the banding or that kind of look that you get from LEDs and lights that pulse. Yeah, so that's going to be a pretty solid option there to work with, I think. So let's see here. Go higher. All right, let's go all the way up to 358. So that's 358. If I go all the way down to like 15... I can see it on my side, but I'm willing to bet the YouTube compression's just killing it. 45 degrees shows it a little bit, but I'll change this back to 216. There we go. All right. Let's see here. There was the other thing that I wanted to cover in here. So, and so you're aware, and I'll change this back to the camera. Michael. Shutter speed is set up through doing SS/gain operation. You come in here and you change it to angle/ISO. This is how you get into that shutter speed gain, and then you can do all the different things that we were just looking at. So on the bottom, you'll see that I've got 180. Because I'm in Synchro Scan right now, it's going to go in 1 degree. But if I turn that off, is where I can go 216, 120, 90, 60, all these different options here. Basically, the lower the number, the more staccato your footage is going to look. So hopefully that helps, Michael. Cool. Let's see here. The other, one of the other things that I want to bring up, oh wow, we're already at 2 o'clock. So the last thing that I'm going to bring up today, as far as the menu goes and how you can kind of make a little sense of the way this works. We get a lot of people that ask us, you know, hey, I want to be able to customize my different recording options, and, you know, I only want to have access to certain bit rates and frame rates that I record at, and I don't want to dig through the entire 10 pages that we have in the GH6 in this case. Well, when you go into the camera, if you go in one, you have display filtering. This allows me to come in and pick whatever frame rate and option that I want, which say I want to shoot 60 frames per second in not 60p, but I want to shoot 60i. So I want to do interpolated. So I can come in here, click display, and now I have my two options. I have 422 10-bit long GOP in 60i, and then I also have a 422 10-bit all intra in 60i. All I have to do from here is just click the Q menu. It says add it to your list, click yes, and now when I go back, you'll see that under Rec Quality My List, when I click in here, it gives me all the different options that I want to be shooting with and not have to go through the rest of the, you know, kind of 10 pages to figure it out. The cooler part about this is that, as you can see, I've got the 5.7K ProRes option in this menu. I've got Full HD 120, 24p. It has that 60i that I just added. And all I have to do is just click on one, and it goes right into it puts the camera in that proper mode for that recording. So then I can come back, say I want to change this back to 120 frames per second, and it gives me that there. So that's probably one of the more useful, I'd say, for someone who's going to be jumping around a bunch of different frame rates. But more useful across the board for a lot of this stuff, honestly, is anyone that has joined for the last couple of weeks knows that I've talked about shooting open gate with the GH6. So I'm setting my camera up right now to the 5.8K in open gate. So I'm getting my setup here, and we're going to change this to this, and we're going to stop down here, get ourselves ready to go. All right. So if I'm shooting an open gate, and say I want to be able to set everything up because I want to output for a 9x16. I'm working with a client, and they're going to be having me deliver content for TikTok or Instagram stories, stuff like that. So in our camera, we have, actually in a number of the cameras now, we have the option called frame markers. So you see, if I go into frame markers and I go to set, I have a number of predetermined markers already here. So 239, 20 to 1, 185, your normal 16:9 options available. I can come in here, turn these on, and know, okay, I'm shooting open gate, so I still have all that height of the frame, but now I've got my 16:9. The little known thing that a lot of people haven't seen, or I haven't seen people bring up yet, is that we also have, if you go all the way down to the bottom, a custom option, which allows me to come in here, program in my own frame markers, or my own aspect ratio that I want to put in here, and move it wherever I want on the frame. So this gives you huge flexibility for being able to actually program in your own particular crops that make sense for your particular output. Be able to save it in there, and then when you're shooting, you've got it set up ready to go. This way of shooting becomes incredibly useful for situations where you don't want to be shooting the same thing multiple times because your client's asking you, or the output that you want to send this stuff to has to go to these multiple different platforms. Shooting in open gate means you shoot once and then you do your post-cropping later. You have a much bigger file to work with, so if you need to send out footage in 9x16 for, say, Instagram stories or TikTok, you can shoot it in this. You're going to have more vertical resolution as well as more horizontal resolution available to work with than if you were to shoot in 4K in 16:9 and then want to crop out a vertical 9x16 out of that. You get infinitely more flexibility in this particular case. Plus, the 4:3 aspect ratio is fairly close to the like kind of 8:10 output. So if you're creating content for some of the more odd displays that are coming out on, say, some laptops, you've got a 4:3 aspect ratio. I think some of the Surface devices are a 4:3 ratio screen. So that's kind of the last thing that I have time to bring up today. With that, let me just double check, see if there are any last questions here. I wonder if LED manufacturer specifies frequency it uses for PWM to control brightness, synchronize with camera shutter speed. It would be interesting. I know that high quality LEDs you rarely have problems with. Lower quality LEDs you can get issues with. But yeah. For ETTR, is there an advantage to using luminance spot meter on your highlights, example till 90 versus zebras and exposing till 90? They're kind of the same thing. Personally, I just prefer using luminance spot meter because I like a slightly cleaner looking overall image. So, like on mine, I just have my, so obviously I have my focus box wherever I want to move it. And then I have my luminance spot meter that I can then just quickly drag where I need it to go. And it gives me a quick readout of what exactly that spot is. I much prefer doing it this way just because it keeps it cleaner. If I have zebras on, or in the GH6, if I'm using dual zebras, I find that I end up focusing on the tools more than the composition that I'm trying to go with. So having this particular tool, luminance spot meter, I think tends to just be a much better tool for this, especially since it's there. And it adjusts properly. So like what we were saying is if I go into my vlog, I know exactly, like, right there just in stops. Make sure that my middle gray is at 0 and light accordingly. or go to my highlight and then set it accordingly. So if I'm going to be ETTR with this, I know then that I can just keep opening up all the way till I get to that. If I have DR boost on, I can go all the way up to that 5.5. If DR boost is off, it's 4.5. So I can turn it on and get right up to that point, and I know that I'm maximizing the amount of highlight information that I can pull back in post. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had time for today. So thank you everybody for jumping in and asking some awesome questions. We'll be back live next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern time, so the normal time that we've been doing this. And in the meantime, if you have further questions that you want to reach out to us, feel free to send us an email at lumixlive@us.panasonic.com. Definitely head over to our Instagram page, give us a like over there, and you can follow us and ask us questions over through the direct messages there. I am over on Reddit as well, under Sean at Lumix, so if you have questions, feel free to reach there, or over on Facebook at Sean at Lumix as well. Next week, we will be continuing some more of these kind of more tech-oriented conversations. Now that the weather's actually pretty nice here in Austin, I'm going to be doing a little bit more with things like Live View Composite, with the S5, to kind of go over that, because we've had a lot of people asking how to actually use that mode and what are some cool things with it. And then, yeah, so we'll be back next week, Thursday, 2 p.m. I hope everyone has an awesome rest of your day. And, yeah, if you haven't already and you feel that the information that I provided was worth it, I'd love it if you gave us a subscribe, a thumbs up, all that kind of fun stuff. It helps me grow the channel. Other than that, take care, and I'll see you next Thursday at 2 p.m. Later.